Okay, now let's talk about flaw questions. The flaw question itself will ask you one of a few major phrasings. First, the argument above is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that it, A, B, C, D, E. The argument above is flawed because it, A, B, C, D, E. The argument is uses which of the following errors of reasoning, or commits which of the following errors of reasoning. So, vulnerable to criticism, by far the most common word choice for the flaw question. Where is it vulnerable? Where is it weak? And we know the answer to that question already. It is vulnerable, it is weak, it is flawed where it has assumed something to be true. Let's go back to that first argument you and I ever looked at together. Rosetta ought to go to Yale. Why? Because she wants to make lots of money, and because people go to great law schools make lots of money. And one of the assumptions of that argument was that Yale is a great law school. Nobody said that. We just assumed it. That argument is flawed. It's vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that Yale may not be a great law school. On the grounds that it is simply taken for granted that Yale is a great law school. And that's it. That's flaw. The flaw is the assumption. Everything else we do is going to be moving towards a more efficient identification of that assumption. So let's talk about answer choices in flaw questions. There are three kinds of answer choices to flaw questions. The first type of answer choice to a flaw question will name a flaw by type. In our next segment, we're going to talk specifically about some major types of flaws, and so we'll learn to recognize the names of those flaws as we get to them in answer choices. So we'll come back to that, put that on hold. The second type of flaw answer choice will name the assumption of the argument. This answer choice will say, for example, the argument about Rosetta should go to Yale. That argument is flawed because it takes for granted, because it assumes that Yale is a great law school. It takes for granted that the assumption is true. Another way of saying it, that argument is vulnerable to criticism. That argument is flawed on the grounds that it presumes without providing justification. That it presumes without providing justification. That it assumes that Yale is a great law school. It presumes without providing justification that the assumption is true. The assumption was that Yale was a great law school. This argument is flawed because it takes for granted that that assumption is true. So you might get one correct answer choice that's phrased that way. Or the third type of answer choice is the type that negates the assumption of the argument. To negate the assumption. Our argument about Rosetta presumes without providing justification that the assumption is true. Presumes that Yale is a great law school. Another way of phrasing that would be to say that it fails to consider that the assumption might be false. It ignores the fact that the assumption might be false. It neglects the possibility that the assumption might be false. In that instance, you might get an answer choice that says the argument above is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that it ignores the fact that Yale may not be a great law school. It fails to consider that Yale may not be a great law school. It neglects the possibility that Yale may not be a great law school. The only thing, in fact, that you can ignore, the only thing you can fail to consider that is a flaw is if you fail to consider the devastating, the ruinous possibility that the assumption is false. So if the assumption is that Yale is a great law school, if that's what we've assumed, the argument is flawed in that it fails to consider that the assumption might be false. I personally love this answer choice. As a matter of fact, my most favorite question of all is the question that says the argument above is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that it fails to consider A, B, C, D, E. Because one of those things will negate the assumption. The answer to that question, if the question stem says it's flawed because it fails to consider, then the answer to that question will be the ruinous, the devastating possibility that the assumption is false. Answer choice A, the correct answer, will say Yale is not a great law school. And if that's true, then the argument is blown to smithereens, it's done, it's finished, and it is precisely because you have negated a necessary assumption of the argument. So those are our three major types of answer choices to the flaw questions. And we're going to get more into these types in just a minute, but they either name the assumption, it takes for granted, or presumes that providing justification, which means it assumes that the assumption is true, or it negates the assumption, it fails to consider, or it ignores the fact, or neglects the possibility, and the only thing that you can ignore, the only thing that you can fail to consider, that is a flaw, is if you fail to consider that the necessary assumption may be false. So, if you have an answer that begins with those words, in order for it to be correct, it must negate a necessary assumption. And those are our 3 kinds of answer choices to flaw questions. Now, in this next segment, we will talk about the 12 major flaw types, and you'll begin to identify those so that you can use them to answer questions more quickly and more efficiently.